IIIT in a series of panels last year also, mashallah. We have a wonderful collaboration with the IIIT and ICNA Convention. Wonderful panels last year, this year again, they have organized these panels. So we are, inshallah, delighted. We are waiting for Dr. Engy AbdelKader, inshallah. But Dr. Nimer is here, and we have specially requested Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool to be here, inshallah. So without any delay, because I know it's a very tight schedule, we have 11:45 to 1:15, already 5 minutes past. So without any delay, I will request Dr. Mohamed Nimer. Dr. Mohamed Nimer, this is one of his books. He wrote more than that, mashallah. Islamophobia and Anti-Americanism, Causes and Remedies, published by IIIT, yes. So Dr. Nimer was, we worked together for several years, alhamdulillah. He worked on the, is an encyclopedia of the Islamic organization and their work in North America. Personally interviewed, I don't know how many leaders and how many organizations. He also published one encyclopedia of the Islamic organization and their working structure and all those issues. He was a research scholar at CARE, and now he's teaching at American University. So we are really glad that he will be, inshallah, speaking. This is related to this topic of Islamophobia, root causes, effective solutions. Dr. Mohamed.
Zahid, thank you so much for the introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm a bit known to be blunt in my talk, so please don't take my bluntness in any wrong way. I only seek to give good advice, and I hope to give the best of it. I did so in my talk to people with the law enforcement community on questions of terrorism and security and the evolution of Islamic movements in the United States. And I will continue with the same pattern in talking with this very respectful audience. Okay, in my presentation I will discuss two manifestations of Islamophobia. Cultural Islamophobia and political Islamophobia. Cultural Islamophobia is general, is based on mainly ignorance, and it's the very general fear of Muslims that is not based on understanding and knowing Muslims. That is cultural Islamophobia. Political Islamophobia is something that I became increasingly aware of and did some research on, especially with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Some of you probably were not even born back then. Some of you remember it were very little children at the time. But for those of you who remember it, that was an incident in which a former white American soldier was involved in bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City, and the bombing was immediately in the media blamed on Middle Easterners and Muslims. Even some false claims were put on the media that 3 Middle Easterners were seen to be fleeing the scene. Completely baseless, completely not based on any factual narration. A politician, a hopeful politician in Oklahoma City who had lost an election, thought that this was a good media opportunity and just jumped on the bandwagon along with longtime Islamophobe Stephen Emerson to blame the attack on Muslim fundamentalists and Middle Easterners. That was political Islamophobia. So political Islamophobia is basically using cultural Islamophobia for political gain. Coming back to the political scene, or as we've seen today in the rhetoric of Donald Trump and his campaign, recognizing that anti-Muslim prejudice can be translated into votes that can be helpful, so you use it. So that is what I call political Islamophobia. My response at the time was to, at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, was to research and publish a report through CARE called A Rush to Judgment. So it was an educational response, because the Islamophobic rhetoric that we've heard was not just limited to such prejudice in the media or statements by politicians. There were people who were killed. There were people who were attacked. There were a lot of incidents of workplace and school prejudice expressed against Muslims at the time. Now those incidents continue to be reported, and I was at the receiving end of those reports at the time, and that led to the idea of issuing an annual report to track this experience of Muslims, experience of prejudice and discrimination. Now, that was the status of Muslim civil rights in the United States, the annual report that still is issued by CARE until today. Most of those incidents, however, do not meet the standard definition, any standard definition of Islamophobia. A lot of those incidents, I remember the first report involved more than half of the incidents dealing with religious accommodation issues. In one of the early incidents that became a public issue involved a Somali woman with hijab who was fired from her job at JCPenney because she refused to take off the hijab. Now, with advocacy championed by CARE and a lawyer, JCPenney reversed its position, and the woman and the employer reached an agreement on how she can wear the hijab and still do everything that she needs to do as an employee of JCPenney. So that involved dialogue, involved negotiations, involved an agreement on the basis of a commitment to the legal framework, the business culture in this country, and the needs of this Muslim employee. Now, that takes me to political Islamophobia. How much time do I have? I mean, I can talk a lot, but I need to get to the chase. I can talk an hour if you want me to talk.
No, I think we started 5 minutes late.
Okay.
So we have 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes. Okay, so let me cut to the chase. Islamophobia is not what that incident showed, and other incidents, there were multiple incidents, probably aware of them, showed that Islamophobia is not a very general condition in the United States. In fact, much of it is limited Yes, much of it is limited to 20% of white nativists and political Christians, if you will, or some parts of the evangelical movement. But it's not limited to those. It goes beyond, and I will explain a bit later how it's beyond just this crowd. But political Islamophobia, much of it is focused or found among this crowd of the American public. So, as much as I have always appreciated the work of CARE and other Muslim groups who work on civil rights and anti-discrimination work, I think we sometimes tend to overdo this aspect of engagement in the political sphere. I think Islamophobia is not the only or the main issue that we need to focus on. I think we need to get beyond this issue of Islamophobia. We need to use the example of that Somali woman in terms of how she reached an agreement with her employer. And this is particularly true of members of ICNA and MAS. ICNA and MAS are rooted in Islamic movements in South Asia and the Middle East. And they are rooted in the idea of working for an Islamic caliphate or an Islamic state. Now, the term Islamic State these days in the media, it's a dirty term. It conjures up images of and realities of brutality and extremism and violence. And I believe until today, neither MAS nor ICNA has come to deal with the American reality. A lot of members have become American citizens, but the groups they belong to have not said what does that mean in terms of the ideology that we brought with us coming to America. And the new generation that is born in the United States and socialized within the movement, they just absorb all the ideas of these groups without and become like just a second generation, just rehashing the same old ideas without actually normalizing their status as American citizens. To normalize your status as American citizens, you need to say what has become of the old ideas. And believe me, brothers and sisters, the originator of the Muslim Brotherhood movement was not even an intellectual, and he did not come up with any new idea. He was an activist who put ideas he learned from Rashid Rida, Al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu into a social movement. That's his major contribution. So, and he was very young when he started writing about political issues. So there is a lot that can be written after Barnelak, but the Muslim Brotherhood movement has not really engaged in meaningful ideological review. And those people who have originated in that movement and who have decided that America now is their country of citizenship, they are in dire need to engage in this process. And engaging in this process and demanding that you should engage in this process is not playing into the hands of the Islamophobes. No, this is something that I have always been aware of, and I used to work on, even though when I was working at CARE. What I'm asking you to do is is basically what Islamophobia is not about. And those legitimate questions should be distinguished from people who use the mistakes of the Muslim Brotherhood or any Islamic group out there to basically just blanket Muslims in general with the image of extremism and violent terrorism. And especially when you have a person like Trump first endorse Islamophobic policy in the wake of the San Bernardino attack, then coming out and saying, we don't know who's who. So I suppose it is of very much important interest to groups like CARE, like MAS, like ICNA, like ISNA, and even IIIT to reach out to the Trump campaign and try to educate them. Trump himself is not, he has no roots in anti-Islam rhetoric. He is the quintessential manipulator of Islamophobia for political views. But we need more and more dialogue. I mean, condemnation of these people is not the best solution. Reaching out to them through education is a better solution. But before you reach out to educate them, you have to reconcile yourself with your own reality. And that is something. The related. It's not about Islamophobia, and I don't want to delve into it because I would be changing the subject. But it's very much related to it because the silence of CARE and MAS and ICNA on these issues feeds into Islamophobic rhetoric. It legitimizes the attacks of somebody like Emerson, and it makes him a legitimate source of information for the U.S. government, whose your tax money is supported. There is something completely wrong in this picture, and there is a lot you can do to address it. And this is where you need to start, because once you normalize your status as American citizens, and you can do it in multiple ways, and I don't want to delve into this, then you will have a position to credibility to go against those people who try to kind of pick points in murky waters. Thank you so much, and I hope what I said is of use to you.
We have Professor Engy AbdelKader in the audience. Sorry?
Can't hear you.
We can hear you.
They can't hear you.
She's on the way. She's on the way.
Sure, inshallah. So next, I would love to invite Ambassador Ibrahim. I first time met Professor Ambassador in Barcelona in this Parliament of World Religion. So I was then I think in Georgetown also, and the amazing thing with Professor Suleiman Yang, and I would request you to make dua for him. He got a major stroke. He spent some time in coma almost, and then we were very much worried about it. But right now, he's in a rehab center in Silver Spring. So please make dua for her health and complete health. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala please shower mercy on him and help his sayah. He used to say that some of our scholars are only scholars, some of our activists are only activists. But then we have town and gown scholars. those who are very much active in the public life, and also wonderful scholarship. So I think one of the wonderful examples is our Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. He was active in South Africa, and the last responsibility was the ambassadorship of South Africa in America. But before that, all I think in the field, in the province, in all those struggles he was there, and then also simultaneously developing the wonderful scholarship. So we like to hear his wisdom, inshallah, on this topic. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I must say that the introduction that I come from South Africa is a very useful one in the context of understanding Islamophobia. That the Muslim community of South Africa is today less than 3% of the population. But it has been in the country for over 350 years, alhamdulillah. The first Muslims who arrived there, my ancestors in Cape Town, were brought there as slaves of the Dutch. They were brought from Indonesia, South Asia, and the rest of Africa. And so, from that moment that Islam arrived, for the next 150 years, Muslims were not just discriminated against. Islam as a religion was banned. If you were found practicing Islam, you could be, your property confiscated, you could be imprisoned, and you could lose your life. You could be executed. I say that to you so that we put into perspective what we understand by Islamophobia. And for 150 years, our scholars were banished to the outskirts of Cape Town, and there is where they could practice their religion. But of course, over that same period we understood that what was done to Muslims in South Africa was also done to blacks in South Africa, because they suffered not Islamophobia, but they suffered racism. What was done to blacks in South Africa were also done to women in South Africa, because some of them had Islamophobia, some have suffered under racism, but they also suffered under sexism and active discrimination against women. And foreigners came in and they suffered xenophobia. So we painted a picture to locate Islamophobia. We painted a picture of where we fitted into what I call the evil family. The grandparents of this evil family is fear on the one hand and ignorance on the other hand. Fear is sometimes instinctive, but ignorance you can do something about. You can learn more about other people. They had children who became the parents of others, of what we would call prejudice on the one hand and discrimination on the other hand. Prejudice, we all live with prejudices. We all like something and we all don't like something. We all like that kind of thing and we don't like something. But discrimination, we can withhold ourselves from. You don't always have to act on your prejudice by discriminating and treating others that you don't like as inferior. And those parents gave rise to a set of siblings that we all know today as racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, bigotry, etc., against a variety of other people. So I want you to paint this family tree in your mind so that you can locate Islamophobia as one of the children of this lineage that we have received. Sometimes, and we must understand, when does a particular way in which we are discriminated against, when does it come from a legitimate cause. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the early Muslims when in Surah Buruj, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. And they were persecuted for no other reason except that they said that they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, when you come with a message of renewal, when you come with something that is different, when you come with something that has in it the DNA of justice, when you come and you present a vision of rahmah, of mercy to all humanity, and when you come and you threaten the status quo because it is not a just status quo, of course you must expect that there will be pushback. As the early Muslims under the Prophet ﷺ experienced when they came with a message of Islam. That is when what you do and what you stand for fundamentally threatens the status quo. On the other hand, as we were told earlier, on the other hand, when people know nothing about you, but because you look different to them, you eat different things, you dress differently, you pray differently, and they build up this prejudice, and they have the power to transform their prejudice into a discrimination that is based completely on an irrational sense of who you are. Then we are dealing with an Islamophobia that is akin to racism, xenophobia, etc., etc. So the first important thing that we must understand is to know what it is that we are dealing with. Because sometimes when a doctor gives a wrong diagnosis, the prescriptions will also be wrong. The medicine will also be wrong, and you may worsen the disease or worsen the health problem. So the important thing is know what we are speaking about. There are some things that we legitimately threaten the status quo about, but there are also some things that we have some control over. And that's done in our name, and that ramps up the fear against us. And so, when we are ignored in the media, or we speak softly in the media, or we don't make statements in the media about things done in our name, then the fear goes up, and our silence may call in a response to us. And then we sit and we wonder, why did we become victims of this? In South Africa, the Muslim community knew that we needed to teach people about us, and that is why slaves who were not Muslim, who came to Cape Town, joined those slaves, they saw in us a liberating ethic. That if Christianity was justifying slavery, then Islam and Muslims were enslaved, then Islam is the answer. And so on the one side, we threatened the status quo and we got pushback. But on the other side, when Muslims acted wrongly, we also understood that we needed to be the first to condemn, if not punish them, for acting wrongly and hijacking our religion and misrepresenting our faith. So the second thing that I'm learning is how do we take responsibility, and therefore the important thing about being a victim of racism, a victim of Islamophobia, a victim of sexism, is to know that you're a victim, but not to internalize victimhood. There's an important difference between the two. When someone does something to you, you're a victim. When you internalize the victimhood, you stop yourself from being Khilafatullah fil ard, agents of Allah on earth, because you have been paralyzed by your sense of victimhood. So the second thing is, how do you make yourself agents rather than internalize victimhood? And so many of us, and we practiced in South Africa, if a white person called us something, we would practice what we would say in response. I find so many American Muslims, been told things in supermarkets and at restaurants and so forth, but none of them have practiced how to respond, because they simply fall into victimhood. And so, what do... So my wife was a commissioner for gender equality appointed by the President of South Africa, and she has taught women how to deal with sexism, for example, and she went into a Barnes and Nobles. And she stood in the queue and she was invisible. And they just didn't help her. And she called the person and she said, "Excuse me, does my scarf make me invisible?" So the point that I'm making, how do we learn certain things that wakens the agency in us, rather than entrenches the victimhood within us? The third thing is that we are facing a clear and present danger in the USA, where we may find Islamophobia institutionalized. At this point, we're dealing with prejudice against Muslims, cultural, social prejudice against Muslims, but we stand on the eve of it being institutionalized and moving from prejudice to institutionalized discrimination. The question is our victimhood so deep that we can't muster a community response to this? That we can't decide that all of us will vote together in a particular way? We all still want to ward off this discrimination against us, but how many of us are prepared to say, "I forfeit my right to be a Democrat, my right to be a Republican, my right to be this, my right to not vote, my right to have problems with democracy," but we don't waken up the agency in us that should A, create coherence amongst Muslims. How do we concentrate our vote so that it leverages a response? How do we make common cause again across our own political preferences in order to have a situation where everyone will know that the Muslims are voting like this? How do we make sure that we maximize our vote? Because only 60% of American Muslims are registered to vote. And if half of them decide to vote, our impact is far disproportionate to our presence. And that's the agency that Muslims in South Africa claim when we decided, A, that the best way to fight Islamophobia in South Africa was to fight racism. And so we joined the liberation movement. The best way to fight Islamophobia in South Africa was to fight the anti-Semitism that was also handed out to Jews in South Africa. And we joined the interfaith movement. And so how do we make coalitions and alliances with others? Last week, Adams convened a platform called the Khilful Fudul, where someone from the Black Lives Matter and the Anti-Torture League and and others came together to consider how can we make broader alliances of all the people who are facing discrimination. So the third lesson is, don't wallow in your own victimhood, but make coalitions, the Khilful Fudul, the Alliance for Virtue. Make it with other communities who are also suffering despite some problems you may have with them. Salvage the most important intent out of that as a way to go forward. Fourthly, fight the whole evil family than just the sibling that is hurting you. Start with fear and do something about it. Diffuse the fear and fight the ignorance and teach people about ourselves. Fight the discrimination and do something to undo the prejudice that may be within people. That's within our power. And so we need to understand, my last point, that sometimes our suffering must not make us impatient. And so, for example, the South African Muslim community learned a long time ago that before our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was Rasulullah, the messenger of Allah, he was in fact Al-Amin, the trustworthy. So many of us have a message to give, but so few of us want to first win trust. And trust is won by interaction. And sometimes we do a range of things that build barriers rather than create knowledge of us. Some of us in South Africa, for example, we love our houses to be shoe-free zones. And I think that that's a good practice. But we decided that the public parts of our houses will be allowed for shoes, otherwise people don't come and visit you. They don't feel free enough to visit you because they must wonder about what socks must they put on, do they have a hole in the sock, etc., etc. And so how can you find a balance that the majority part of your house is shoe-free, but a part of it is welcoming to the public? Some of us, we create barriers in our house between men and women. And we interpret things in a particular way, and so we can manage that. But I think that when important women also come to visit us, we also let them sit with the women in the kitchen. So how can we build trust between us and Americans? Some of us have very strict interpretations of halal, and so we can never accept an invitation to come and have dinner rather than use the opportunity to teach people about our culture, about our dietary habits, and so forth and so forth. So what I'm saying is that we need to become al-amin so that we can overcome a lot of the problems that we're facing. And most importantly, we need to understand how we can make A, common cause amongst ourselves and have a show of strength, and B, how do we make common cause with other victims of discrimination, other victims of prejudice, other victims also of wrongdoing in our society, because I recommend to you that sometimes the best way to fight Islamophobia is by us fighting racism. The best way to fight Islamophobia is by us fighting sexism and all the other diseases that go with it. But I have done my job. I've kept this mic warm for the main speaker, who I work with, is my neighbor at Georgetown University. So thank you very, very much for listening to an in-between speaker. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. And before that, I would like to invite our next speaker. I have actually, as a moderator, I have a couple of announcements. The convention organizer, they asked the all moderator to make those announcements. It's a little late, but please turn off your cell phones. I should have said it in the beginning. Anyhow, one thing is on the social media, like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, Snapchat and Instagram. Feedback, we'd love to have your feedback, and go to ICNA Convention.org/FB. The mobile app, convention mobile app, ICNA Convention 41, so you can go to and then download that free mobile app, and I think that will be helpful. If you are already done it, that's wonderful. But most important, next 4 years, we won't be able to have our convention on the Memorial Day weekend, because Ramadan is coming, 3-year Ramadan, and 4th year exactly Eid al-Fitr is coming on Memorial Day weekend. So 2017, 18, 19 and 20, we have to switch. So next 2 years we already decided, and then we are working with, we love to be in this area in Baltimore. So next year please mark your calendar, April 14 to 16. And then again the format will be changed. It will start from Jummah prayer and end on Sunday afternoon. So 14, 15, 16, 27 is an Easter weekend. So please, this is very important for the convention next year planning. I know there will be a little bit hesitation because the college exam will not be over, but this is this is the only way we have to have it, because we cannot have on the Memorial Day weekend. ICNA have a membership booth in the main hall area, Bazaar area. So I think we would love to all our brothers and sisters join ICNA and MAS and work together. Support our sponsor. Please check out the list of our sponsors in the convention mobile app and support them by visiting their booths in the Bazaar area. And we have, because this year the theme is about the Quran, so on Sunday today there are two programs. One is already being held this time, but another session will be on 3:30 p.m. on Quranic recitation. It's a beautiful recitation, you can hear that. So inshallah that, and then with these announcements for a moderator, I would inshallah invite Engy AbdelKader. She's recently Professor John has sent one of her articles, a wonderful article about Islamophobia. She wrote about that. She's working with the BRIC initiative in the Al-Wali Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, teaching over there and working a lot on this issue. So without any delay, Engy AbdelKader, please.
Assalamu alaikum. So as you heard, my name is Engy AbdelKader, and I work with Georgetown's Bridge Initiative at the Al-Wali Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. The Bridge Initiative is a new project that is focused exclusively on researching Islamophobia and then connecting those research findings to the public square. Because oftentimes public conversations about Muslims and Islam are premised on false assumptions, misinformation, stereotypes, without enough academic research findings to actually undermine and counter those false impressions. And so our job is not just to undertake research, objective research about Muslims and Islam, but to also make sure that that information reaches the hands of lay Americans as well as individuals in Europe and around the world. So with that introduction, I'd actually like to thank ICNA as well as IIIT for making this panel possible, and also apologize for my tardiness. I'm spending time with family in New Jersey, which is where I was born and raised, and underestimated the amount of time it would take to get here. But I'm happy to be here and to see all of you for this session. The purpose of this particular panel is to explore root causes and potential solutions surrounding Islamophobia in the United States, which is really a critical issue confronting American Muslims of all backgrounds, of all ages, of all experiences. And I'm of the mind that the root causes of Islamophobia are actually many. I believe that they stem in some of the foreign policy decisions that past and current administrations are making, including military interventions, which then leaves lay Americans viewing American Muslims as a potential enemy here at home. I think root causes also include coverage of Muslims and Islam by news media outlets in the United States as well as in Europe. So research shows that in 2015 alone, 9 out of 10 news stories involving Muslims or Islam in the United States, in the United Kingdom, as well as in Germany, relate to violence. So when your American neighbors, co-workers, classmates are learning about Muslims or Islam on their iPhones, on their computers, on TV, it's generally because they're watching coverage related to terrorism or wars. And since American Muslims are only a minority in this country, we constitute about 1 to 2% of the entire population, it is very difficult for individuals to actually come into contact with law-abiding, everyday Muslims. Therefore, by virtue of necessity, they're oftentimes getting their information about our communities from the news media. Or alternatively, they're getting it from popular culture and popular media. So for instance, last year, one of the most successful blockbuster movies in our country, and in fact around the world, grossing millions of dollars, was American Sniper, which depicted Muslims as barbaric, violent, and terrorists. It had ultimately a dehumanizing effect. In addition to our foreign policy decisions, military interventions, news media coverage, there is also the phenomenon of anti-Muslim political rhetoric, as well as the Islamophobia network, which is a multi-million-dollar industry. What I'd actually like to focus on during my remarks is the former, the political election season we currently find ourselves in. My organization, the Bridge Initiative, just put out earlier this month a research report titled "When Islamophobia Turns Violent: The 2016 U.S. Presidential Elections." And what we did is we looked at two distinct but overlapping periods of time to see whether or not there was any kind of relationship between the anti-Muslim political rhetoric that we keep hearing from typically Republican presidential candidates and increasing levels of hate crimes targeting Muslims, Muslim institutions, or those perceived to be. So essentially we started with January 1st, 2015, and then looked until December 31st, 2015. So the entire course of 2015. To look at what was the terrain, the religious freedom landscape confronting American Muslims in this country. What we found is that there were approximately 174 acts or threats of violence during that time period. That is actually a jump from the 154 hate crimes recorded by the FBI in 2014, the previous year. So what that tells us is that when the election season began, which actually began last March, American Muslims were already feeling under siege. In fact, the first individual to declare his intention to run for high office was Texan Senator Ted Cruz. He did so on March 23rd of last year. That was approximately 1 month after the murders of 3 American Muslim youth in their homes near the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill campus. We recall the hate crimes of Dia, Yusur, and Razan. They were executed by Craig Hicks, a neighbor, in their homes, and investigating law enforcement officials claimed that it was related to a long-standing parking dispute. But their family members and community leaders and activists insisted this was a hate crime. Specifically, one of the family members, as you recall, cited a statement by one of the victims prior to her death that she sensed that Craig Hicks, the murderer in this situation, hated them just because of who they are. So already, at the time of the first declared intention of an individual to run for high office, American Muslims were already feeling fearful. What we found is that after Senator Ted Cruz declared his intention to run for high office, the other candidates began falling into place and doing the same. And while Islamophobia was certainly present, we noticed some interesting trends. Donald Trump, who's the presumptive GOP nominee for this election season, didn't declare his candidacy until June 16th of 2015. Interestingly, he did so while attacking immigrants, and specifically Mexicans, as rapists and criminals. The reason why that's interesting is because by the time you look at the situation confronting American Muslims in terms of threats and acts of violence in July, just 1 month later after Donald Trump had declared his intention to run for high office and begun this xenophobic political rhetoric, you actually see an escalation in terms of the hate crimes. It went from about 4 in June, when he first declared his intention to run for high office, and then began his xenophobic political rhetoric, to 12 in July. And so there's a question about whether xenophobic political rhetoric, even when not explicitly targeting Muslims at that time, may have had an adverse impact on our community. It also supports the contention that violence, discrimination, prejudice, and bias confronting any community, including Muslims, is really a concern for all Americans. It can have an adverse impact upon all of us. The first surge in Islamophobic political rhetoric actually happened last September. Last September is when we first saw that Dr. Ben Carson went on Meet the Press and stated at that time that no Muslim should be trusted to hold high office. So no Muslim is qualified, just by virtue of the fact that they are Muslim, practicing Muslims particularly, to be President of the United States. This was followed by support. Support by fellow individuals who are also running for the presidency, specifically former Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, as well as former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who both voiced their support of Dr. Carson's position. It also was followed by support from members of the GOP party, who actually began sending Dr. Carson more financial campaign contributions after he made these explicitly discriminatory, Islamophobic remarks. When we saw this trend, we asked ourselves, well, why September? The first candidate actually declared his intention to run for high office back in March. What happened? What was it about September that actually triggered this rise, this surge in Islamophobic political rhetoric? So we looked to the New York Times, and what we did is we examined the headlines for the New York Times during the course of the month of September of last year. What we found was interesting. For most of the month of September, the issue, the news item that dominated the New York Times headlines at that time was the Syrian refugee crisis. Day after day, there was coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis. And according to research from Oxford and Harvard, media coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis is generally negative. What that means is that when you read news or see coverage on television or on your computers or phones about the Syrian refugee crisis, it's generally in the context of a potential terrorist threat. It's generally in the context of Muslims potentially dominating Western democratic societies, of potentially undermining Western democratic values. And so perhaps for that reason, we saw what is really an issue concerning immigrants having an adverse impact and devolving into an issue of Islamophobia. Because the Muslim community mistakenly is often perceived as a foreign immigrant community. Although in reality, Muslims have been a part of this country even before its founding. The second surge, one more thing, so what about the hate crimes? What happened with respect to hate crimes confronting American Muslims? In August, before the surge in Islamophobic political rhetoric, there was one hate crime, at least one that was reported. In September, there were 10. Now, I realize that when you're talking about a community that numbers several million, that 10 hate crimes may seem trivial. It may not seem a whole awful lot. But it's important to realize that of those 10 hate crimes, 3 were murders. 2 brothers in Florida and 1 university student in California. And so I imagine if we were to ask their mothers, their fathers, their sisters, brothers, friends, or neighbors, 10 is 1 too many. 1 is 1 too many. We're talking about violent attacks targeting individuals because of their religious identity or perceived faith community. and that's unacceptable under any circumstance. The second surge, okay, I speak fast. The second surge in Islamophobic political rhetoric, according to our research, occurred in November of last year. So while the first surge happened in September, was led by Dr. Ben Carson, the second surge was led by Donald Trump. He embraced his Islamophobic rhetoric in the context of the Paris attacks on November 13th of last year, which were soon followed by the mass shootings in San Bernardino, California. In fact, it was immediately following the San Bernardino attacks that Donald Trump's campaign issued an official statement regarding a ban on all Muslim immigrants to the United States. But Mr. Trump didn't stop there. He took to the airwaves to double down on that position, as well as other problematic and discriminatory positions regarding the American Muslim communities and Muslims more generally. These included surveillance of mosques without any credible evidence of wrongdoing, special IDs for Muslims, potential databases and registries for Muslims. It also included a number of problematic discriminatory statements, such as telling Anderson Cooper of CNN, "Islam hates us," or other media pundits that 27% of Muslims in the United States are militant, which is not true. So what happened as Donald Trump was articulating these discriminatory positions with respect to threats and acts of violence? Interestingly, in November, again, in the context of a terrorist attack in Paris, as Donald Trump was taking to news media outlets to talk about the closure of mosques and surveillance of mosques, we found that hate crimes against Muslims and Muslim institutions tripled. Half of the attacks targeting Muslims in November were against mosques. So as Donald Trump attacked mosques, there were physical attacks against mosques. In December, we actually saw the increase of these violent attacks fivefold. So threefold in November, fivefold in December. In fact, the month of December accounts for a third of all the violent attacks against Muslims last year in 2015. In the time I have remaining, I'll share a few interesting observations that we made. First, while we oftentimes think that Muslim women are the first victims of violence, and they are in fact identifiable because they wear conspicuous religious attire in many instances, our research found that while Muslim men and women suffer verbal assaults on the same level, comparable rates of verbal assaults, with respect to violent physical assaults, Muslim men are more susceptible. We also found that during the campaign election season that we examined, Muslim men were 11 times more likely to be victims of murder than Muslim women. Additionally, we found that the age group most affected by this violence, particularly murder, were American Muslim youth. They were ages 18 to 24. So hate and bias and prejudice is literally killing our youth. If we thought previously that we could run away and ignore the problems in public schools by putting our children in private Islamic schools, we should now realize that Islamophobia is coming to them. We have to tackle it. And each one of us holds a potential solution. In fact, if you look at the election year cycle that we're currently in, look at the amazing positions that American Muslims have taken to counter the Islamophobia that they see. out of a sense of urgency. Rose Hamid, for instance, who engaged in silent protest at a Donald Trump rally. Nabila Noor, who appeared via YouTube at a Republican televised debate to ask the candidates what they were going to do to confront Islamophobia. The young American Muslim mother, who was also a former Marine, who asked the question of Hillary Clinton, what are you going to do about Islamophobia? Making news not just around the country, but around the world. These individuals are not trained activists. They have no background in speaking up and speaking out. They're regular American Muslims just like you and me. But they know that something needs to be done. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I will, inshallah, because of the time constraint, I will, in 7 to 10 minutes, I will finish my presentation, and then we have, inshallah, question answer. We have wonderful analysis of root causes and also manifestation of Islamophobia in the US. And then also we heard the effective solution, especially in the background of South Africa. So what we are doing here. So I think I will, instead of making comments, I think I will go directly that we have in the, like in ICNA and MAS and all other national organizations, we realize that there must be 3 prongs of the solution. One is that among all these national organizations and our masajid and our shura councils and all these individual efforts, there must be a unity platform that to counter all those Islamophobia and different type of attacks. Number 2 is, the key word is engagement. And number 3, the key word is communication. So, unity, engagement, and communication. The first part, alhamdulillah, to some extent, we were able to, after several years of communication each other, 2 years before, we were able to form US Council of Muslim Organizations, USCMO. Not every national organization part of that, but the majority of the national organizations and now shura councils and individual masajid, they are becoming under one platform. It does not mean that they are abandoning their own identity. No, they are working on their own, but at the national level, they have that platform. USCMO, US Council of Muslim Organizations. And we are inviting all other national organizations, shura councils, masajid, regional organizations, local organizations to come under that platform. And there are a lot of details on that issue. Second thing about the engagement, and then there are 4 types of engagement. One is the participation in the process. Second is about making alliances with other groups, with the civic groups, with the religious groups, with ethnic groups. And then we have open houses with the society. But more, I think the most importantly, the engagement with the society in the field of social services. Because remember, all these perceptions which we have been seeing, and we heard that, with all these surveys, opinion against Muslims are gradually increasing. Hate crimes numbers are increasing. Perception is against Muslims is increasing. We cannot argue with we cannot answer in arguments. We have to show our behavior, a consistent behavior that we are good, we are the people of khair in this society. So about participation, especially about this political process, this year we had a leadership summit in December, and then they decided all this, whatever this Islamophobia is doing, they are dividing the country. dividing the country that this group is bad, this group is on the basis of color or creed or religion. They are balkanized, they're doing balkanization of the United States. So we will be doing One America campaign. Unity for this America, for this American values. And over there we also decided that we will be making an effort to million voters registration drive. Not necessarily Muslims, but we're working with Latino, working with Afro-American, Latin, working with other ethno-religious groups, minority groups. We like to increase the number of Muslim participation and other groups participation in the process. So Alhamdulillah, we have started that, and maybe this year you have seen that. So all this material is ready, and we are providing to all masajid poster, flyer, cards, this pin you are looking at, the caps, but then also going to masjid, to community, that we have to increase our participation. And this will not be in one shot. From here till election, we will be asking in November and in the month of June, in the month of Ramadan, for everybody. Masajid, they could, other than the voter registration, they can have on June 18 iftar for public officials, their community, their neighbors. Even they can have during the month of Ramadan iftar for home shelter people and with the food bank. Individually, we can have iftar with our neighbors, non-Muslim neighbors, inviting them at home. So any activity we can do that. But then on the Eid al-Fitr, on Eid al-Adha, so we have to increase our efforts, inviting others, and then also working on for this voter registration and all other making with those efforts. For example, just we are discussing, and inshallah we will be informing that on Eid al-Adha, we like to have a national. By the way, Eid al-Adha is coming at this time. This is the estimate on September 11th on Sunday. We like to change in that way that it should be a national Muslim voter registration drive on Eid al-Adha. And on Sunday, September 11, we can have a major effort for that reason. Then we are working with other groups. They are organizing a national voter registration day on September 27th. More than that, all those who are working with different masajid, we like to have a first ever national open mosque day on October 16th. For example, in America, if we can, under this USCMO banner, 1,000 masajid, they have national open mosque day. That will have a big story for the media. So I think all these efforts we have to, that's the one type of engagement participation. Then alliances. I think what we have learned from Catholic experience, Afro-American experience, Jewish experience, Mormon experience in America, they have to have not only organized themselves, but also making alliances. So the same way, now the Muslim community is doing that. So with USCMO, we have started dialogue with National Council of Churches, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, and other groups. So we, inshallah, will be meeting more with the Latino groups, with Afro-American groups, and we like to have those alliances. But more than that, we like that our masajid, our local community, they are doing that. When the number have increased, they should have more alliances at the local level. We cannot win this type of struggle by our own. We have to have alliances with them. And then we have what I said about the social service. I think that is the most important thing. And we like that Muslims should be involved with that. In ICNA relief, and we have worked with several masajid, any disaster, national disaster happen, Muslims are there. With ICNA relief, with other Muslim groups, with local Islamic centers, they are there. We have established this 14 women shelter house, means better women, their shelter house. Then this year, for several years, we have been doing back to school giveaway, one project, where we are giving these school supplies for 1 year to those needy students. This year our target is, and we need your cooperation, that at least 100,000 bags should be distributed in different communities. I think a couple of years before, we were discussing these issues with President Obama's National Community Engagement Director. No, he's not there, but he's on some other assignment. And we explained that this back to school giveaway. He said that this is the right thing because this discrimination or Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, it is not a one-term issue. It is not even two-term issue. It's a long battle. We have to be, we should be careful about that, and we should be cautious about that. But the best answer is to be engaged in the society. Then you will have positive media coverage, and you are doing with everybody, not only for Muslim. Every person who is in need in those school districts is involved in those type of activities. So we like to have this type of engagement, in participation in the social service, and in these alliances, in interfaith, and all those. So we like to be involved in those engagement. So that is the most important thing. So we have created One America campaign.org, uscmo.org, all those websites, and within this month of Ramadan and July, inshallah, you will be having more and more communication from us. And we like that the masajid, the different communities, different organizations, that should be becoming part of that campaign. We are also exposing Islamophobia on that website, and we have all those resources from Bridge Initiative, from West Coast. They have a wonderful center documentation on Islamophobia, and all of the reports. You will be finding all those reports, videos, and different things that should be involved in that. Then the next point is, and then I will be, inshallah, just finishing that, that is the communication. And communication is all sorts of things. It means from word to word, talking to your neighbors, but more than that, the social media, ethnic media, mainstream media, electronic and print media, we have to have that, and we like our youth to be involved. So we are making all those arrangements, but whoever like to work in that direction. So ethnic media is very important. We have Urdu, Farsi, Bangla, Arabic, Turkish, and these communities English newspaper and program. Then we have the mainstream media, electronic and print, and they are covering that. We should not consider everybody as enemy. Means right now, for example, last year, ICNA, we were able to have 130 big signs about Sirah, about Rasulullah in different cities of the US. And Alhamdulillah, with your help, we were able to create and have 250 positive reports in the mainstream American media. You name it, Reuters and AP and CNN and even Fox, everybody covered that in a very positive way. So even our campaign, although we just planned, we announced, New York Times covered that. And all this anti-Muslim, lot of this hysteria is going on. But again, I think the other side is that from the mainstream American religious leaders, political leaders, editorials, columnists, all those, they are speaking against that. So we should be aware of that. Even the New York Times is writing editorial and column against Republican onslaught on Islam and anti-Muslim rhetoric. So all those elements are going on, and we understand that. But our role is, yes, there is a root causes, and there we have to address those root causes, no question about that. All this manifestation, we should be aware of that. But alongside that, the other side is the lot of American political, social, religious leaders, they are condemning all these acts. And Muslims should be aware of that. These are our friends, we should work with them. But more than that, our own engagement, our own communication is that's more important. So right now, this is the one campaign, and this year, and there are several other levels, we will be meeting with both parties, both candidates attending both their convention. We like to open all this dialogue. So, but we like the local level. Not only presidential election is important, local election is the most important thing that we have to be involved over there. So that's our invitation, that this countering or making effective solution to all this Islamophobia is, we have to be engaged and we have to communicate all our efforts. So right now we have around maybe 11-12 minutes. So I'd like to invite any question to any speaker to just introduce yourself. Put a very short question, please, very precise. Yes, Dr. Abul Qasim.
Just give me something.
we learn from some people procedures and methods, bluffing, cheating, Quran and
I'm sorry, we could not hear.
Assalamu alaikum. Brother, you mentioned that we have to learn from some groups. You mentioned their method is cheating, bluffing. Will you be learning that way, or Quran and Sunnah, which are not sufficient for us?
Obviously, we should not learn cheating and all those things. I think you have a question, please.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zahid Bukhari. My question is about the media. I'll direct my question to Dr. Kadir. That media has always been, since we know the media is anti-Muslim. First question, why they hate us? Why they present our every news or any news with negative connotation into it? And about every news which comes out from the Muslim countries, they put something negative into it, there's a negative impact. And what we can do about it? And is there any Muslim media effort that we can address, we can at least bring their attention that their behavior towards Muslim community has been very negative and counterproductive?
Can we have a microphone here?
Jazakallah khair for your question. So I think with respect to the media, you know, I mentioned research from Harvard and Oxford about the coverage about media with respect to the Syrian refugee crisis, as well as what we saw last year. What we also saw though last year as well, 9 out of 10 news media stories about Muslims and Islam related to terrorism and violence more generally. We also saw that 2015 actually saw the highest rates of news media journalists using the word Islamophobia. So that's significant because previously the journalists refused to use the word. If they used the word, they would use it in quotation marks to say Islamophobia as though that's not really real, right? So I think that's significant because the first step to addressing a problem is being able to identify it. So having a term that actually captures the phenomenon itself and then journalists actually embracing it, which is I think what the research shows in terms of, so I think that's sort of the silver lining in the current situation, which means that they're realizing this is a problem that needs to be addressed, right? How do we change the coverage? I tend to believe that a lot of the bias that we see in the news media may be unconscious. They don't necessarily recognize that it's biased. For instance, maybe they don't recognize that the terms radical Islam is problematic because all the politicians and in fact academics are using it. Maybe they don't realize that the word jihadist or jihad in reference to terrorism and criminal acts is problematic because the terrorists themselves are characterizing their acts as quote-unquote jihad, and they want to be identified as quote-unquote jihadists because it placates their own and serves their own political interests. So I think part of the solution in response to your question is education. I think we need to be able to be in a position where we educate members of the media as well as the public about what terms are acceptable and which are not because they are inherently discriminatory or biased, right? So I think that's the first step. The second step, I think, is to actually have more Muslims going into news media. So traditionally, we've often encouraged our youth and children to pursue the sciences, engineering, medicine, so on and so forth. More recently, I would say within the past decade, we're seeing more Muslims becoming lawyers, so embracing law. I think we need to continue pushing our youth to pursue journalism so that we have more individuals like Ayman Wahideen and others who are notable, who are succeeding and eventually will be able to dictate the editorial line, or at least provide additional nuance and insight into some of the stories, right? So I think that's key. I think each of us has a responsibility as well. So I think oftentimes, particularly with our huge organizations that do so much work on our behalf, we often assume someone else will take care of this. CARE will take care of this, ISNA will take care of this, ICNA will take care of this. But each of us has a responsibility. We just heard about the importance of local politics and being engaged and active locally. Each of us is capable of picking up a pen, encouraging our children or youth to do the same, and writing a letter to the editor when we see a news story that's problematic. When something is happening in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our towns, that is something we need to highlight or speak about. Ramadan is coming up. Let's write a little bit of an op-ed to the local paper, speaking about what is Ramadan, what does it mean to me as a 16-year-old, as a 25-year-old, as a 40-year-old, and providing that perspective. So I think each of us can actually play a role as well, and I think that's the more Islamic perspective from where I stand. I know there's a hadith by the Rasul that says that if you see something that's wrong, you should try and change it with your hands. And if you can't with your hands, then use your words. And if you can't with your words, then at least hate it in your heart. This is something we can do with our hands by picking up a pen and writing. So write to the editors, and I think we can make a difference in this way.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right now.
Can I take one point here, please? My perspective as a government servant, and the son in the army, and my son-in-law in the army, and especially the son of the general in the army. I say this, you're talking about the soft side of taking on the media.
Would you like to come here, sir?
I believe the U.S. media is predominantly controlled by Jewish organizations, predominantly Abraham supporters. You have in Congress people like Dr. Schumer, Peter King, and many others who are openly hostile to Muslims, and they do everything possible to derail Muslims making a good name in the United States. The press is totally dominated by them. According to Siyasa, a Hyderabad India paper, they publish in detail who owns whom in the United States, starting with New York Times, starting with CNN, which is now controlled by the state of Israel almost, and you've got people like the commentator who's born in Jerusalem, Wolf Blitzer, and many others who look Americans to me, but they are not. Their interests are the state of Israel, not what. This I maintain, I've written to all the congressmen by certified letter, and the person who responded to me was McCain. I think we have to take the side of making sure candidates for against Muslims fail in the elections by giving money. That's what they do like that.
Sir, I'm sorry, we have only 3 minutes left. We have to finish in 1:15, and there are a couple of more questions. This young one actually raised hand. I'd like to hear his question, and then Dr. Ismail again. 2 questions, and then I think our panelists will answer it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tarek Shah. I live in a very right-wing and conservative town in southern Pennsylvania, and whenever I tell people I'm Muslim, I'm sort of looked down upon. I'm usually asked questions about like the terrorism relating to Islam. And one day, one of my classmates asked me about this one verse. It said, "Kill all the non-believers," and I wasn't able to like answer this with a solid answer. Could you just explain to me like how would I answer these kind of verses in the Quran?
There will be some other time.
I think that was exactly my question. That was exactly my question.
I didn't. Okay. I'm sorry. Just a minute. I know we love to have this conversation, but the problem is the time frame. And then we will come to the weak conversation.
I think this is important question, and we have to answer him directly right now, or educate him on site.
Sure.
What does it mean? Because there is a history. Because
here, I think the sisters are complaining that we are not seeing their hands. Yes.
My question is for
Can you come here, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you. My question is for you, Dr. AbdelKader. You mentioned at the end some of the interesting findings that you had from your research, and one of the things you mentioned was that Muslim women, while there's an equal amount of verbal assaults towards both Muslim women and Muslim men, there's less physical attacks towards them. Do you have any theories or analysis as to why that is? Is it because even though they're bigoted, people don't want to attack a female? And secondly, did you notice any rise in verbal and physical attacks towards Muslim women, specifically after the San Bernardino event that happened, when you have a Muslim woman being presented as possibly somebody who is at the forefront or radicalized her husband?
Okay, more questions from sisters. Any sister? Okay, Dr. Ismail, I think you have a question.
I think I had the same question.
Okay, that's fine.
Same question. Basically, because there are so-called experts on Quran who come and misquote the Quran on the mainstream media, there has to be a united response to that. I think that was how.
So any other burning question from the audience? Very burning. Okay, that's that young one, I think the red shirt. And then our panelists will inshallah address that. So on the recommendation of the organizer, we are extending some time for this panel.
So unlike this brother, assalamu alaikum everyone, I come from a very left-leaning, very liberal town where actually most of my support does come from the people of the GOP or people who are Republican, because they typically want more diverse people, more diverse voices. So even when you have people like Donald Trump speaking out against Muslims and Islam in general, you have people like Rand Paul speaking for Islam and Muslims. So with a whole united front for people to become politically engaged, is there somewhat a split on which party or which ideals we should follow? Because it's a very, very close block for being either a Democrat or a Republican while being Muslim.
Can I, one by one, from Dr. Nimer, Ambassador, and Professor Engy?
One idea to how to deal with the negative media, the times that the Muslims are mentioned negatively are also the times when you can plug in your own piece. And a lot of the times it's about some bad things that are happening in the Muslim world, something that ISIS or Al-Qaeda did, or the Muslim killing and violence. So that is a time for you to inject yourself to show how different you are from what's going on in the name of Islam. And I suspect that we don't do that. We don't do that enough. You can do it as groups and you can do it as individuals, as Dr. Engy AbdelKader said. The ayah that you mentioned, وَاقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ ثَقَفْتُمُوهُم وَأَخْرِجُوهُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ أَخْرَجُوكُم, kill the pagans wherever you find them and expel them from wherever they expelled you. That was revealed in the context of war. A war against a specific enemy, and of course, when you are engaged in a war, and killing happens in war, and kicking them out of homes that they kicked you out of would be like retribution that happens in war. So it's not about picking out people who are, because they're not Muslim, you go kill them. One of the earliest acts of Prophet Muhammad treatment with non-Muslims is that when he, even before the first Islamic State was established, he advised the persecuted Muslims who had no support to go to seek refuge in Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. And he told them it was ruled by a just king, and that just king was a Christian. So, this notion of us versus them, or Muslim versus non-Muslim, in terms of how we classify the world, is a very erroneous one. It is not something that the Prophet Muhammad himself endorsed, and it is not something that we should defend.
Well, thanks very much. Just something as a rule of thumb, in having fought extremism in Cape Town by Muslims, For example, they quote these ayat to justify why they can bomb anyone and so forth. We've learned the simple rule of thumb. If you want to understand what that verse means, go 5 ayat before that and read it, and then go 5 ayat after that and read it, because between that, you'll find the context. If you just extrapolate 1 ayat, we can do the same with the Bible. It's even sometimes more horrific. But we don't do that because we're not in a battle for right and wrong yet. We want to find our values. So I would say that's a good way of thumb, a rule of thumb, to try and understand the context of an ayah that is there. Then you will pick up the war and what happened there and so forth and so forth. And then later you will find, for example, say, but if they incline to peace, then you also incline to peace. And so we need to learn to read the Quran differently. I think, just quickly, because I think that the brother deserves a little response. So, we don't opt out of the system because some people cheat and lie. We don't opt out of earning our money from the economy because some of the economy is based on cheating, lying, and exploiting people and underpaying people. I think we always work as Muslims to change the system and to improve things as we go on. Opting out is not an option because it's like voting without voting for your own profession. I think that that's very important to understand. I also think that we underestimate that in a communications battle, sometimes you first have to win, as Dr. Nimer says, you first have to win the battle against those who look like you, pray like you, eat like you, and talk like you, and everything like you. You first have to win the battle for interpretation before you can even get outraged with those who use what your worst examples are saying to work it against you. So I think that we must, our media and communication must be a double-edged sword. The one sword cutting ignorance, prejudice, Islamophobia from those outside of our fold, the Donald Trumps and stuff, but the other edge of the sword must be as sharp against those who misquote, misuse, abuse, and hijack our religion. If we can't do a double-edged battle, then we must give up. And that's very, very important. And then I think that the last one is, besides having to make up your mind, do you go with a left liberal or do you go with a right-wing GOP? First decide what's your values. If you know your values, then Allah will guide your heart further than that. But if you say, okay, who's flattering me the most? Who's offering me the most? Who's speaking sweeter to me? Then you may make mistakes on your flattery, but you will miss the real lessons of standing for what you believe in. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. So I'm going to try to address each of the 3 questions very quickly. To the young brother in the front about his experience in schools, I'm going to address it a little bit more globally to say that there's several things that need to be done before the young brother gets to this situation, right? First of all, with respect to parents who have children in public schools, we need to be present in those schools and representing who we are as a community and what our religion stands for, right? So what this means is that when there's Ramadan is coming up, or there's Eid that's coming up, much in the same way that all the school children are doing crafts and reading books and learning about Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa and Diwali, they're not going to necessarily be learning about Ramadan and Eid and what we believe and celebrate. So we need to be proactive and take the initiative of contacting every single year, the school teacher, introducing ourselves, explaining that my son or my daughter celebrates these holidays. I'd like to be the surprise reader. I'd like to come on. We now have a new book called Ramadan, Curious George. I'd like to read it to your class. I'd like to read these texts. I'd like to do a craft. The reason I say that is that it helps give our children a strong sense of self when they are a minority in a Christian majority context. In addition, you are educating other non-Muslims from a very young age, as opposed to tackling these issues as 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds when they are already stubborn in their ways and opinions, right? In terms of how do you respond to questions that you have. Again, this question is brilliant because it's really not about this young brother who posed it. It's about the fact that our community centers, our organizations, our mosques have to have events for youth that train them how to confront this kind of questioning and confrontation in all different contexts. Whether it's happening at school, whether it's happening at work, whatever context that it's happening, we're talking ultimately about religious literacy. You cannot confront bigotry and Islamophobia that is being perpetrated against us if we do not have a sound basis, a sound knowledge in our own deen. We have to be confident, we have to be solid in our understanding to be able to push back against the bad information. We heard from Ambassador Rasul, it's all about context. Ultimately, the response is it's about context, and this is not just true of Islam or Muslims, it's true of every religious faith. But what our brother is asking about is telling us that we need to be providing more services for our youth. In addition, in terms of the youth who are in there needs to be events. We need to find the allies. We're talking about alliances. There are allies. There has to be at least one school teacher in the school where we can approach them and say, I'd like to do an event or a teach-in about Islam, Islamophobia in school to educate the students as well as perhaps the educators about Islam, and don't wait for a crisis to happen. Oftentimes we're so reactive. We wait until crisis mode. Someone's being bullied. Someone is being expelled because they push back after years of oppression and bullying. And now we're starting to speak up. Be proactive. Don't wait for the crisis to happen. So this is really about, you need support. You need support from whoever will give it to you. Whether it's the school administrators, well, school teachers, your parents, family, friends, you need support. You cannot be battling this on your own. So that's schools. The women. So a note about our methodology in terms of when we looked at the acts and threats of violence during the election season, we relied primarily on news media reports. So these are incidents and events that are reported in the news media, whether local, national, or international. We also looked at various statements that were put out by CARE, okay? Why do I mention this? I mention this to say there are maybe various reasons why we happen to find that most of these attacks were against men. It may be that men have reported more of the attacks than women. It may be that the news media chose to only report on those particular attacks. It's not entirely clear why. I don't have an explanation. What I do know is that I personally, when I undertook this research, I suspected that most of the violence would have been directed at Muslim women. That was what I thought, and I was surprised to find that the research findings were contrary to that. That's not to say that Muslim women are not still suffering high rates of discrimination in employment in terms of barriers to employment, harassment on the job when they do finally secure a job, or the fact that they're not subject to bullying in schools. That can still continue to be the case. This is a very specific inquiry that we undertook. Regarding party politics, I thought Ambassador Rasul's response was great in terms of values. I would also just say, look at who serves your interests, right? As an individual, but as a community. In the past decade, there has been one party that has consistently attacked the Muslim community. Consistently, unabashedly, with no shame. Make up your own mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Especially at 3:30, there will be a town hall meeting, again the same subject, and the participation 3:30 p.m. in the room 339. Thank you very much.
We will have a third session by IIIT on bridging the gap with theology and science right here at 2 o'clock. And you're welcome to join us. We will have also 5 panelists to talk about this.